I would like £1, or indeed $1, for every time I've been asked at a dinner party, how can you defend a man you know to be guilty? There is, of course, an enormous public appetite for true crime and trial dramas and documentaries, and so often, most members of the public, both here and in America, simply do not understand the ins and outs of police investigation and the trial process. And as I often tell my juries, if you had seen on television or in a movie the things that you've just seen and heard in this courtroom, you would have said it's not possible, it must be exaggerated. What truly goes on in courts is much stranger than fiction, and that, of course, is the fascination of the job for trial advocates like me, Jonathan Goldberg, KC, which means King's Counsel, and my old friend Dean Strang, prominent American criminal trial attorney. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to I Rest My Case.
Today's episode is going to be different than most in that it will involve a case in which you, Jonathan, were directly involved, albeit not at trial, but later on a subsequent appeal in the case. This really is an exception. Most of the cases we'll consider, and the themes beyond cases we'll consider, will not relate to cases that we have handled personally. Indeed, some of the cases we'll look at will have occurred long before either of us was born.
Yes.
So let me give a brief background on this episode's case. It's known, especially in the UK, as the Marine A case. The event happened in September 2011, the court-martial originally in 2013. Marine A was an acting color sergeant in the Royal Marine Commandos. He had completed 4 previous combat tours and was 8 months into his 5th combat tour when he encountered a mortally wounded Taliban insurgent in a field in a dangerous area of the Helmand Province in Afghanistan. He administered the coup de grace, firing a bullet point blank into the wounded Taliban fighter's chest and killing him, or hastening his death. His death was inevitable anyway, but he hastened his death. And for that, he stood court-martial.
Dean, let's just pause there for a second, because not all our listeners will know what a court-martial is. Perhaps you just explain it simply.
A court-martial is simply a court run by the military and applying to members of the military. There's some collateral coverage of their family members if on a base. But the idea of a court-martial, martial is M-A-R-T-I-A-L, is a court of war or a court of the military.
So, Dean, let me begin, perhaps towards the end, with how I came to be involved in this case. Now, I'm lucky enough to have been very friendly with a great man who was the author Frederick Forsyth. And sadly, Frederick died recently, or Freddie as we all knew him. And Freddie was, I have to say, a great British patriot. He'd served in the Royal Air Force himself. He was a pilot when a young man before he became a Reuters correspondent, and decided that he needed to make some money, and that's when he sat down and wrote The Day of the Jackal. Freddie would always ring me if he had a legal problem in one of his novels and he wanted a bit of background information, that sort of thing. But he rang me on this occasion and he said, "Have you heard of the case of Marine A?" Now, at that stage, his real name was not being made public because it was thought that there might be reprisals from the Taliban or people supporting them. But now it is public, so I can say his name was Sergeant Alexander Blackman, And as you rightly say, he was in the Royal Marine Commandos, which is perhaps the elite regiment of the British fighting forces. The day this occurred, there had been an attack on a nearby command post about 800 yards up the road from the command post which Blackman commanded with about 15 other soldiers in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. And essentially, there was a balloon that had cameras that was able to watch everything that was going on the ground. And because they saw two Taliban fighters who had attacked the command post up the road and were now running away, they sent out an Apache helicopter which fired 139 high-velocity rounds towards one of these guys. And everyone thought he must have been killed because it's pretty exceptional to survive that kind of attack.
Well, and let's note, too, that not only were there 139 rounds fired from that Apache helicopter, but they were 130 millimeter rounds.
Absolutely. But Blackman was sent out with a patrol of 8 men to go and do battle damage assessment, which essentially meant to take photographs and fingerprint the corpse to see if they had documents on him already and knew who he was and what level of terrorist he was and so forth. So everyone assumed they would be finding a dead body, but lo and behold, when they arrived in the middle of this cornfield, they found a barely alive, but nonetheless still alive, Taliban fighter. I later called a pathologist for the appeal who said that this fellow could not have had more than 15 minutes of life left in him anyway, because literally his organs were hanging out. Now, at the moment after they found him, there came through on the headphones of Blackman, who was the commander of this patrol, there came through a message that other Talibans were now attacking a command post just up the road, and he and his men were likely to be called there immediately to give support. Because another remarkable thing of this farcical campaign in Afghanistan was that the British Army were impossibly stretched, and whereas they should have had probably hundreds of men in these small forts in the most dangerous square mile in the world, as it was acknowledged to be at the time, in this particular area, there were grenades coming in and bomb attacks and attacks with IEDs, that's to say the hidden improvised explosive devices, the whole time. But he was told, you're going to be needed further up the road. And what do they do with this dying man? Well, the protocol was that they should have radioed for helicopter ambulance, and this fellow should have been treated as a prisoner of war just as well as a wounded Marine would have been treated in the same circumstances. But the problem was the helicopter was liable to be shot down in this particular area at this time because the Taliban were known to have rocket-propelled grenades normally. And Blackman knew this. If he called in a helicopter, it could easily be shot down. And meanwhile, he's being asked to go up the road to give assistance to the hard-pressed fort just nearby. So that's the background to his having taken his pistol out and dispatched this guy, as you say.
There wasn't any real question about the facts, as I understand, because 5 or 6 different video clips captured what he did, what everybody said, captured the immediate events of the coup de grace that he administered to this Taliban fighter.
Not only that, but they captured what was being said as well. And if I can just add this to show the incredible things that happen in courts and cases. I mean, who would believe this? That it was against regulations for any of these soldiers to have had a helmet camera. And nobody realized that one of them, who was shortly to go home, he'd finished his tour of duty, he had a helmet camera in order to take pictures to show his wife as souvenirs of his tour in Afghanistan. Nobody else knew that he had this. So he went home, And about a year later, he and his wife fell out, and the wife wanted a divorce. And she said to the police, he looks at videos of children. So the police snatched his computer and interrogated it, and there were no photographs of children, but there was this whole incident captured, as you say, on 6 clips. So, talk about bad luck. And that led to an investigation by the military police and to everything else which you know.
What was the verdict, the result?
Well, the problem was that there's no such thing as a mercy killing in English law, or as I understand it, in American law. I mean, you and I know that soldiers since time immemorial on a battlefield have begged their comrades to put them out of their misery when they're mortally wounded. And there's even accounts of the Battle of Waterloo where soldiers begged the other side to put them out of their misery. And in those more honourable days, that happened, and nobody was going to the press or filming it, and everybody was pleased about it. But of course, that's not the politically correct world in which we live nowadays and in which armies have to operate. So there was no such thing as a defence of mercy killing. So it had to be murder or nothing, depending on other factors, to which I'll come. So the final result of the court-martial, where the only defence that was run by Blackman, as I say, I didn't then appear, I only came in later because of the request from Frederick Forsyth on appeal, and the final result was he was convicted of murder after a long trial. The 2 of the other Marines with him, who were also charged with murder on the basis they had allegedly encouraged him, they were acquitted by the court-martial, and he was given a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum of 10 years to serve. That means you actually do serve every day of those 10 years. And even then, you're on parole and on license, and you can be brought back to prison if you steal a bottle of milk, and so forth. And that was the final result. Now, as I say, I didn't appear on the appeal. Colleagues did. I have to say they didn't do a good job. I found many respects in which I had to criticize their conduct of the court-martial when I got to the appeal. But they brought a first appeal in 2014 to a very high-powered court, really the 3 most senior members of the English Court of Appeal, presided over by the Lord Chief Justice, himself very experienced in criminal cases. I was actually at university with him. He's now Lord Thomas. I'm not Lord Goldberg, unfortunately. And the only point on which the appeal was brought was a nonsensical point of law, suggesting that the court-martial system was not compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. It didn't stand a chance, and it was very quickly dismissed. But the court mercifully reduced that 10 to 8. So that was the situation when I was brought in nearly 2 years later, because Frederick Forsyth had read the transcript and he was incensed by it, and he rightly realized this guy hadn't had a fair trial.
Well, let's back up. In the abstract, in the world of nice, neat theory, we have on the one hand perfectly understandable and indeed morally correct laws of England and indeed international law, the law of war, that says you may not kill a subdued or captured combatant. Once he's a prisoner of war, once he's laid down arms or been captured and rendered harmless to you, you may not kill him. That's murder. And again, in the abstract, who wouldn't agree with that? I agree with that, at least. I get it. On the other hand, we have probably, I didn't serve, I've never served, but I'm given to understand, and you've mentioned, that we have a practical code among warriors, probably going back centuries, under which they understand tacitly, look, if I'm wounded mortally in battle, if I am beyond help and hope on a battlefield, do me in, put me out of my misery. Don't leave me to suffer 15 or 20 minutes or to be found by enemy forces. Put me out of my misery.
Absolutely.
An ugly reality, probably, of being a warrior, but an understandable one. Okay, so we've got these two things colliding potentially. On a strictly legalist or formalist look, Marine A committed murder. He hastened a mortally injured man's death by a few minutes. As a warrior, both of them might have chosen that, but it seems to me there's another context here in either deciding whether murder should have been mitigated in some way, or at least whether the sentence should have been mitigated, by asking, what was the mental state of this man who was in his fifth combat tour, this one 8 months long, or he'd been at it for 7 or 8 months at this point. And as you mentioned earlier, he's one of a complement or detail of only 16 soldiers at this advanced command post. They should have a minimum of 25. Their daily routine, the Court of Appeals eventual judgment tells us, was put on at least 100 pounds of gear and go out into hostile fields for 5 to 10 hours on patrol, carrying 100 pounds or more of gear, and do that in temperatures that at that time of year averaged 50 degrees Celsius. For our US listeners, that's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And then come back after 5 to 10 hours of doing that every day, try to sleep when in fact nighttime is the most vulnerable time for your advanced command post. You have to fear being overrun or attacked during the night, and then get up and do it again.
Do you know that they didn't even have a water cooler once they got back to this command post to have a cold glass of water? They didn't even have a refrigerator. Can you believe this? And as you say, in 52 degrees centigrade heat. But not just that, the command post itself, I've of course seen full photos and a video of it, and it was like a sort of Club Mediterrane straw village. There was no roof. There was just a sort of not very impressive wall around this little compound. It was like originally a farmyard, I think. And the Taliban regularly threw grenades over the wall at night, so the soldiers had to sleep huddled against the wall itself. And it was wholly insecure. On one occasion, the gate blew open in a wind. The conditions under which these brave soldiers were supposed to operate and apply the Geneva Convention to their enemies impeccably. Another point was that if they were captured, and this happened in several cases, they knew they would be tortured to death, horribly tortured to death. And many of them were, and several of them were, and their body parts hung from trees for the others to see later. The British forces in Afghanistan operated under rules of engagement called Code Alpha, and these had originated in Northern Ireland when British troops were policing the troubles there. So you can understand it in Northern Ireland, and what they essentially said was that if and when attacked by the Taliban, if, for example, a grenade was thrown at you, as often happened, but the Taliban then turned his back and was running off, or perhaps was on a bicycle or a motorcycle, as again often happened, you couldn't shoot back at him. You had to let him go because he was no longer an actual physical threat. Can you believe that? So you had to wait till he came back again tomorrow and perhaps didn't have as much luck when he tried to kill you again. It was just outrageous, the conditions under which we expected these soldiers not just to operate, but also to behave legally and impeccably.
And Marine A, because of injuries in the complement of soldiers, had been thrust into the leadership role among these 16. His father had died a few months earlier that summer. Did anybody think to look at his mental health? My understanding is that nothing of the stresses and possible adjustment problems that Marine A was facing at the time was introduced at his trial, but that trial counsel did raise that before the original sentencing. Am I right about that?
Yes, and this was a primary ground of my having to say that the King's Counsel concerned was incompetent. He's now dead, unfortunately, but I'm afraid I had to say it to the Court of Appeal when he was alive, and they agreed with me. The main defence that Blackman ran was this. He said, when I fired the shot, I thought he was already dead. And there was some support that you'd have to be a doctor or a nurse to realise he wasn't, because there were periods shown on the video when he appeared completely lifeless, and then other flickers of life at different times on the video. But it was possible that Blackman could have genuinely thought that he'd already expired when he shot. And he said he was shooting just as an act of anger and revenge to desecrate the body. He didn't think the fellow was still alive. Well, that may have been a tall story and all he could say in the circumstances. Of course, he never admitted that to me, or so far as I know to anyone else, but that was his defence. And the guy defending him should immediately have said, well, given the terrible history of stress and strain, he'd had a grenade thrown at him unsuccessfully just 2 days earlier, for example. His favourite officer had been murdered by the Taliban a couple of weeks before. His best friend had been killed. Some of his other friends' body parts had been hung from trees. And just, it was the most, as I say, the most dangerous square mile on earth. An improvised explosive device was going off under these patrols on average once every 16 hours in this area. Can you imagine that? So the most obvious thing for any defending lawyer to have said, well, we must have a psychiatric report because he may be affected by having been 8 months in this area without being relieved, except on one occasion he'd gone back to England for a week because his father had died to scatter the ashes. But otherwise it was completely unremitting and the most appalling tour of duty from all points of view. So a competent lawyer would have said immediately, we must get a psychiatric report. The lawyer didn't get a psychiatric report for the trial at all. He ran the trial solely on this basis. He thought he was a dead body, yes or no. If the court says no, he's guilty of murder. Simple as that. He did get a psychiatric report, unbelievably, when it came to sentence. So having been convicted, there was then a few weeks before the sentence hearing and the plea in mitigation that had to be made. And at that point, the penny must have dropped, and they obtained a psychiatric report from a good doctor. I used him again on appeal. And the psychiatric report said the guy was suffering from combat stress disorder. Well, that's getting perilously close to a mental health condition that would have served, as indeed eventually it did, to reduce murder to manslaughter on the ground of diminished responsibility. Because in English law, if you commit a murder, but you're under such stress at the time that you have a mental illness, then you can use that in mitigation and it brings it down to manslaughter. And the importance is this, that murder carries a mandatory life term of imprisonment. And the judge sets a minimum term. Here, as you know, it was 8 years, reduced to 8 from 10, but a mandatory life imprisonment, whereas manslaughter can be nothing to infinity. That entirely depends on the court's view of how bad the circumstances were or weren't. And here, of course, there were many mitigating circumstances. So it was very important. And at the end of the day, when we did obtain this psychiatric evidence in proper format that the lawyers below had failed to do, of course, it was so powerful that it persuaded the same Court of Appeal, the same 3 judges, brought in another 2, by now 5, because of the notoriety of the case and the public concern and the press concern about this case. England went mad about this case, you know. It was in the papers every day. There were enormous demonstrations of Royal Marines in Trafalgar Square and outside Parliament and outside Downing Street regularly. People just went crazy because the people realised how outrageous this sentence was in the circumstances of what had happened, but the law didn't. There was this tremendous disconnect between what the public thought should have happened to Blackman, which was frankly nothing, and what had actually been imposed by the court in the name of showing the world. These were indeed the sentencing remarks of the judge at the court-martial. The world had to be shown what a moral army Britain was, that it didn't behave in this way. An example had to be set. Well, isn't it really stuff and nonsense?
Now, for centuries, English law, as I understand it, has treated murder as the intentional killing of another person with something called malice aforethought, and we can leave that aside for the moment. Manslaughter, on the other hand, for those same centuries, has been the intentional killing of a person, in a sense, without malice aforethought and under extreme circumstances.
Or indeed it can be accidental. It needn't be intentional.
Correct. Heat of passion, other extreme disturbance of the psyche, or the mental state. And here specifically, as I understand you, the belated psychiatric report before sentencing, but after the court-martial, after the trial itself, showed combat stress disorder, which I think under current English law would not establish manslaughter, but could be considered in mitigation of a murder sentence, what the minimum term on a mandatory life sentence would be. You were able later to get further psychiatric evidence diagnosing not just combat stress disorder, but something called adjustment disorder. And that, unlike combat stress disorder, that adjustment disorder would have allowed the jury to return a verdict of the lesser offense of manslaughter rather than murder. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. Almost, not quite, Dean. Let me say firstly that on a court-martial in Britain, you are tried not by a jury of 12 ordinary citizens, but by a board of 7 officers. So 5 of the officers were Royal Marine officers, who of course didn't know him at all, and the 6th and 7th were from the Royal Navy. And they're officers of every rank, from colonel down to ordinary soldier. And the way it works is that the most junior officer has to vote first in order that he shouldn't be affected by the rank of his colleagues. Funnily enough, I've done many, many court-martials. I've defended in well over 20 of them. I never lost one. And I found it was a court that if it could possibly find a way to acquit a good soldier, they always would. Anyway, they weren't given the chance here, were they? But the answer to your question is that it was a little more nuanced, because the psychiatrist who'd written the report saying combat stress disorder, he later appeared again before the Court of Appeal, now instructed by me along with other psychiatrists, and he said, well, you know, I didn't use the phrase adjustment disorder simply because I knew it was too late. I knew there was no point raising diminished responsibility. That wasn't my brief. I was just trying to put in layman's language the mitigating circumstances, and that's why I used the phrase. But if I'd been asked previously, did I think this was diminished responsibility, I'd have said, yes, I think it amounts to an adjustment disorder. So it was even more absurd. Murder is intentionally killing or causing grievous bodily harm from which the man dies. But manslaughter can cover, as you've said, a myriad circumstances where something criminal has happened. I mean, you can drive your car so recklessly that you kill a cyclist, and that can be manslaughter. Equally, you can find your wife in bed with her lover, and you're so provoked as to kill one or other, or both perhaps, and that can be manslaughter by reason of provocation. But the circumstances here were so ripe for manslaughter because of diminished responsibility, because of the mental state of this man who'd been forced to undergo such terrible circumstances for the last 8 months, almost without respite.
Was the public reaction entirely on the side of Marine A?
On the final day when the verdict was announced, we had to make a separate courtroom available because there were so many members of the military who wanted to watch the proceedings, and they all came in their uniforms with their medals. We had 7 generals sitting in the public gallery, I recall. There was an incredible outpouring by the public of support for Marine A. Of course, the main tabloid newspaper in Britain, the Daily Mail, were paying the legal fees. Lucky me. And they were running the story every day. And we even had, at one of the rallies outside Parliament, we even had a lieutenant colonel, a man called Southby Taylor, who was a great hero of the Royal Marines because now retired, he'd had such a distinguished career in action all over the world where the British Army had fought since the Second World War. And he was so incensed by this, he made a speech at one of the rallies, I heard it, and then he wrote an article in the newspaper saying, "I shot my own sergeant major in the insurgency in Doha in 1968 because he begged me to put him out of his misery. You come and arrest me." And of course they didn't dare.
Acting Color Sergeant Blackman was in the highest non-commissioned rank one can hold in the Royal Marines.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
I think I probably know the answer to this. But if we start with the lowest commissioned officer above him and move up the chain of command from there, were any of the people who sent him on a fifth tour duty and kept him for 8 months, who put him into a position of leadership, who failed to fill out at least 25 spots there should have been in that platoon, who failed to reinforce the command post, on all the way up to those who made the decision to send British troops into harm's way in Afghanistan, were any of them ever held to account for any of their decisions, let alone their snap decisions under circumstances like these?
Not at all. They all got away with it, but isn't that life? There were so many fascinating side issues raised by this case in the background, and one of them was this. His commanding officer was a Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Lee, and Lee was a high flyer. He'd probably be the commandant of the entire Royal Marine Corps. He'd taken command of Blackman just 6 days before the incident, and obviously he hadn't had time to familiarize himself with all the men under his command or the locale yet at all. But he was so incensed by the fact that his predecessor, a Lieutenant Colonel Murchison, had only visited Blackman's little fortress once in 8 months, because it was too dangerous for him to take the roads. He might be shot. The Padre, who in the Royal Marines is basically, the counselor, the person, if you're having problems, you go to for guidance, a chaplain. But his role, interestingly, in the Royal Marines, they give him a wooden rifle that is the same weight as the real rifle, and he has to do the Marine Commando course, so he's a tough nut himself, even though he's not actually firing a real rifle. It was too dangerous in this place for even the Padre to visit. So, talk about loneliness and isolation and alienation.
So what was the upshot of the 2016-2017 appeal that you handled?
The eyes of the country were on this case. They really were. Putting it mildly, the pressure on me me and my wonderful juniors, I should say, was quite significant. But perhaps I can say I rose to the occasion. So it was an amazingly dramatic 3 days. I mean, the argument was intense. The prosecution were not giving an inch, not an inch. And they fought this as hard as they possibly could to try and keep the murder conviction. But happily, the court was persuaded that this new psychiatric evidence, had the court-martial known of it, would have made all the difference. And the court was persuaded they would inevitably have found manslaughter at worst, had they known of this psychiatric evidence. So we won, and he was sentenced to manslaughter. It was, of course, sentence at large now, not a mandatory life term, and the court gave him 7 years. You may say, why 7 years? The answer was that when you get sentenced for anything that's not murder, so it's not a mandatory life term, you actually served at the time 50% of whatever the sentence was. So giving him 7 years meant he only served 3.5. And because he'd already served a day or two less than the 3.5, he only had to spend an extra day or two in prison before they released him. So the court, of course, chose the figure of 7 with that in mind. It meant his immediate release. But what was even better, and was so meaningful for him and his wife and for the military community, was the court-martial had reduced him in rank to a private, had cashiered him, as I think you would say, had taken away his pension rights, and had thrown him out in disgrace. And the court reversed all that. And although they said they couldn't keep him in the army, we even had quite an argument arguing that they shouldn't dismiss him from the army. But the court kept his rank, kept his pension rights, and reinstated him to an honorary discharge, such that he can still call himself Colour Sergeant, he can still call himself Royal Marines. That was, more meaningful, I think, than anything.
There's a rough U.S. equivalent to this case, and it goes back decades. In March or April of 1968, a young man, a U.S. soldier, essentially just one rank above the equivalent of Colour Sergeant Blackman, so a second lieutenant, which is the lowest commissioned officer in the U.S. Army structure. A second lieutenant named William Calley led Charlie Company, a small platoon of soldiers, into a village called My Lai. It was called My Lai in America. The Vietnamese refer to this as Son Mi, under orders to clear out and kill Viet Cong. That much was undisputed. But they found no Viet Cong in the village. What they found were old men, women, and young children. And by the time this small platoon under Lieutenant Calley's command left that day, something like 504 Vietnamese citizens, non-combatants, had been slaughtered by the U.S. troops. The women had been raped, some of them. Some of the older girls had been raped. And then the Army covered it up for more than a year. It came to light only because one of the soldiers who participated wrote a letter to President Nixon, I think at the time, disclosed it, and a journalist began digging into it. In 1970, Lieutenant Calley was charged in court-martial with many counts of murder. 24 or 25 other U.S. military personnel, on up to and including 2 generals, also were charged. The news accounts vary on whether it was 25 or 26 who were charged initially, but one of those 2 numbers. The generals had their cases dropped early on. 17 other charged people had their cases dropped early on. 6 eventually stood trial in court-martial, and of those 6, only Lieutenant Calley was convicted. He was convicted of 22 counts of murder, sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years to serve. The command chain reduced that initially to 20 years, reduced again to 10 years before he even got into the military appeals process. The conviction was upheld, but President Nixon directly ordered that Lieutenant Calley be transferred to home confinement rather than to Leavenworth, the military prison at Leavenworth, Kansas. And in the end, he served about 3 months of time total. Much of the American public at the time, of course, the Vietnam War was incredibly divisive, especially in its final year. Throughout it was, but by the early 1970s, it was an incredibly divisive issue in the United States. And much of the American public reacted, as did the British public, which was sensing that Calley was a scapegoat. And that as awful and atrocious as the behavior of those soldiers, that he was being offered up as a sop to the indefensible, to the murderous actions that had occurred there and that no doubt occurred many, many other times during our 11 plus years of engagement in the Vietnam War. I bring that up just because I will say the cover-up didn't happen in Blackman's case, at least not for so long. The soldiers didn't talk. It was accidentally discovered, but once it was, the British Armed Forces moved quickly. Whether they moved correctly is another question altogether.
Oh, yes, they had to show how righteous they were. Was saying earlier, this Oliver Lee resigned his high-flying career in disgust at the way his predecessor, a Lieutenant Colonel Murchison, had left Blackman to his own devices for 8 months in this hellhole. And of course, Murchison denied it and said, he'd behaved in the best traditions and all the rest of it. And there were absolutely murders going on behind the scenes between these two colonels. I think in an earlier era, perhaps they'd have fought a duel, actually, but they don't do that anymore. And there were so many spin-offs in terms of the controversies that this case raised within the military. Many of them didn't get publicized, but I know about them. At very high level, tremendous anger and finger-pointing and buck-passing. And in a sense, the worst thing that happened was that Oliver Lee, who was such a fine man, I'm still in touch with him, and so obviously was destined to be a general or beyond, if not a chief of staff, an exceptional soldier, and that he resigned in anger at the way Blackman was treated. And let's just think, how many of us would sacrifice our careers on a point of principle to protect an ordinary soldier?
Indeed, it's what you would hope everybody in a command position would do, but we know they wouldn't.
Yes.
You and I can't resolve for our listeners whether Marine A should have been charged and prosecuted at all. On the one hand, it's obvious that you don't need a legal advisor to tell you that killing a disarmed and now harmless combatant is wrong.
But you see, Dean, even there, I would argue with you, because is he meant to bring in a helicopter to evacuate this guy when he can see the guy's absolutely at the point of death and the helicopter can be shot down?
No, I'm with you. I'm with you on that. I'm just saying,
yes.
In the abstract, let's say an uninjured, disarmed enemy combatant, rendered harmless, oughtn't be shot and killed. That one's easy, and
that's
ordinary
easy.
Moral sense ought to tell you that. But that's not what he confronted. It may be, and was, I think, what Lieutenant Calley and his complement of troops confronted, but this is not what Color Sergeant Alex Blackman confronted at all. The man wouldn't have lived, probably, for a medical evacuation by helicopter. If he had, the helicopter might have been shot down. I don't know, to me, the Geneva Convention matters, the laws of war matter, moral sense matters, but this is a murky, murky case, certainly on what you would do under those circumstances at that moment and in the mental and psychological condition in which Marine A found himself. Yeah. We can't resolve that, but that's part of what we're trying to do here for the people who listen to and engage with us, to ask them to consider, what should we be doing different going forward? How did the system handle this? Did it acquit itself well or not? And when I say system, I mean the armed forces, the military courts, and the civilian justice system.
I would add that, to me, the academic law comes off very badly in this case. We have a saying, hard cases make bad law. This was a hard case. Because there should be, shouldn't there, for soldiers in the field, in the heat of battle, a mercy-killing defense? Of course there should be. That should bring it down to manslaughter. But you and I know the law permits no such defense. It's neck or nothing, murder or nothing in these circumstances. There should be a defense that because he didn't want to risk a helicopter being shot down, and he knew that any moment now he would be called to go to the aid of the command post up the road that was being attacked, so he would be called to save the life of his comrades there, arguably. That should be a defense, but it wasn't in the circumstances.
You don't actually mean a full defense. You're only proposing a partial defense from murder down to manslaughter. which leaves a British sentencing court with the range of 0 to infinity, as you put it earlier, on what exactly to do. And maybe that's exactly where the discretion belongs at that point. There's a recognition of criminal wrongdoing with the manslaughter, but a full ability to say, was this nothing but a mercy killing, or was there something more malevolent to it than that might warrant some actual incarceration without just scapegoating the soldier in the field?
You know, Dean, we had a great Lord Chief Justice here called Lord Geoffrey Lane in the 80s. And Lord Lane said many times, but the governments didn't listen and haven't listened since. But of course, such good sense. He said we shouldn't have murder manslaughter at all. We should just have murder, but give judges the discretion to sentence from 0 to infinity. Leave it to the judge on the facts. On this case, it would have been 0, no doubt.
You and I both know that you cannot get discretion out of the system, both from the police officer on the street at the front end to the prosecutor, the Crown Prosecution Service there, the local district attorney in the United States, on up to the judge, and indeed to the appellate courts. You and I know that. The discretion will be there somewhere, and the question is who best to exercise it. And I'm with you on these circumstances, the trial judge, who's heard the evidence and has looked at the accused and the witnesses, is in the best position to exercise some discretion that really ought to exist there.
And if he gets it wrong, well, there's a court of appeal to put him right.
Absolutely, absolutely. One battlefield decision, lifelong consequences, and a nation divided. Next time we travel back to the Cold War, espionage and execution, the story of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. For now, I rest my case.